This is not a test. This is not a drill. That's how it started. On networks across the world, familiar voices, the kind that usually report election results or storm warnings, suddenly breaking into regular programming. Calm at first, but too calm, like they were reading from a script they barely understood themselves. We urge all listeners to stay tuned for a live emergency broadcast. That's what they said. No further context, no details, just that dry repeating message. A pulse racing through the airwaves from station to station, across borders, languages, and time zones. Within minutes, the emergency bulletin was everywhere, cutting into music channels, podcasts, weather reports, even pre-recorded religious sermons. You could hear the edges of confusion in their voices, the presenters stumbling slightly as they read words no one prepared them for. The signal itself carried something strange with it. Underneath the words, there was a hum, a low vibration beneath the broadcast, like the frequency itself was unstable, or like something else was riding the signal, hiding in its shadow. Then came the locator ping, a beacon from somewhere deep in Siberia, a research station we'd never heard of. No official name, no entry in the International Geological Database, just a set of coordinates and a voice identifying itself as Vostok Relay 9. That voice, shaken but steady, said they were broadcasting live from the edge of an impossible discovery. Something had emerged from the ice, and the world needed to hear it in real time. And so, the world listened. The voice that followed wasn't a scientist. It wasn't a government official. It was a reporter, a freelancer embedded with the research team, hired to document the excavation for a minor science publication. His voice trembled, not just from the cold, but from what he was seeing. He described it in fragments at first. Equipment failing for no reason, instruments blinking in and out like the machines themselves were losing grip on reality. Scientists running back and forth, shouting into radios that gave no reply. And the air, he kept coming back to the air. He said it felt thick, like breathing underwater, each breath tasting faintly metallic, like blood warming on your tongue. Then came the real confession, what had pushed the station into a live broadcast no one authorized. Something was moving inside the ice, not melting, not collapsing, moving, as if it had been asleep, and the excavation had set an alarm it couldn't ignore. He said the ice didn't crack normally. It peeled, layer by layer, as though something on the inside was shedding its skin. And from beneath the frost, flesh appeared, pale, almost translucent, wet with ancient condensation, quivering under the excavation lights. It wasn't just one body. It was several, curled around each other in a formation too deliberate to be random. Not fossils, not bones, but something alive, something aware. His breathing quickened on air. You could hear him moving backward, his boots crunching over frost as he tried to explain what he saw next. There was an eye, still sealed under a thin veil of ice. But the reporter swore it was watching him, tracking the sound of his voice even as he spoke. Then, just as he said those words, the feed collapsed into static. For a moment, the static gave way. The reporter's voice came back, ragged, still trembling, but now filled with something beyond fear, awe wrapped in disbelief. He kept repeating the word nest, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it less impossible. Not fossilized, not hollow shells. A nest intact, preserved so perfectly it looked like it could have been laid yesterday. There were eggs, more than a dozen, cradled within a pocket of softened earth. Their surfaces glistened, beads of ancient condensation clinging to their shells. But it wasn't just moisture, it was movement. One of the eggs twitched. Not a crack from age or pressure, but a pulse from within. The thin membrane of frost shifted, rising and falling like a creature breathing in its sleep. And then, under the halogen lights, it began to hatch. The outer shell peeled apart in slow, deliberate layers, and inside, something moved. A tiny claw, slick and trembling, reaching into air it was never meant to breathe. The reporter's voice cracked as he described the first eye that opened, cloudy, like it had been dreaming for millions of years and was waking to a world it no longer understood. The hatchling dragged itself free, gasping, quivering, alive. Its skin looked wrong, too soft for a creature so old, its muscles trembling under gravity that no longer matched the ancient earth it came from. It wasn't strong enough to stand, but its head turned, not toward its mother, not toward the other eggs. It turned toward the sound of the reporter's voice, as if it recognized it, as if the sound itself was familiar, like it had been listening long before the excavation began. The reporter's breath caught, his voice dropping into a whisper, like he was afraid to speak again. And then he said something none of us could forget. It knew we were coming. Before the signal cut again, the reporter managed to patch through a live feed from the station's scientific team. Their voices were no calmer. These were experts, paleontologists, geneticists, virologists, each trained to expect the unexpected. But none of their training prepared them for this. One by one, they tried to explain how this was possible, how an embryo could remain alive for 66 million years, not fossilized but paused, as if time itself had folded around the nest. Some blamed microbial preservation, an ancient bacterial film sealing the eggs in suspended animation. Others proposed a chemical anomaly in the ice, some unknown compound that created conditions science had never seen. But the theories collapsed faster than they could be spoken, because none of them explained the movement. The way the hatchlings seemed to respond not just to light or heat, but to sound itself. They reacted to voices twitching toward anyone who spoke, as if language, any language, was something they recognized. The lead biologist's voice shook with something like shame when she admitted the truth. This wasn't just evolution's miracle. This was something prepared, preserved not by accident, but by design. And when the reporter asked the question hanging in the air, designed by who, no one answered, because at that moment, the feed collapsed again, leaving only silence and the soft crackle of eggshells breaking open. That's when the phone lines exploded, not just here, everywhere, across continents, across time zones, into every station still carrying the signal. Some callers sobbed, others screamed, and some just wanted someone to believe them. A leading geneticist demanded to go live immediately, insisting this was the discovery of the century, the missing link, not just between species, but between eras themselves, proof that evolution might not be a straight line, but a loop. He barely finished his sentence before a theologian broke in from the Vatican press office. He said this had nothing to do with science. This was Genesis reversed, the undoing of human dominion over Earth. If something older than humanity was waking, then it wasn't just a scientific event, it was a correction. And then came the others. A retired U.S. intelligence officer claimed this matched declassified files from the 1960s, when Soviet ground-penetrating radar found something moving under the permafrost. But the files were buried, and the station shut down before anyone could investigate. A woman, identifying herself only as a survivor, called in to say she'd heard that sound before, the hum riding the broadcast, the layered frequency under the voices. She said she heard it in her dreams as a child, and that her grandfather heard it too during his time stationed at a Soviet outpost just a few miles from the dig site. Call after call piled up. Some said it was the voice of the earth itself, rising through the last thin layers of silence. Others believed it was a warning, sent to anyone who could still listen. The reporter's voice crackled back into the feed, overwhelmed, unable to process the weight of what was being said. In the background, a faint drip echoed through the line, like water thawing off ancient stone. That's when we heard his breath catch, short, panicked, the sound of someone seeing something they shouldn't. The reporter didn't have time to explain. All we heard was a scream, sharp and primal, cutting through static like a knife through skin. It wasn't a scream of pain. Not exactly. It was the sound of understanding. The moment when a mind touches something it wasn't made to hold. Then the line shattered into silence. Not static. Not distortion. Just silence so perfect. It felt designed. Like a door slamming shut on the world. That was the last transmission from Vostok Relay 9. But the hum? The hum never left. They say there are moments that split time in half. The seconds before you know and the seconds after you can't unknow. This was one of them. As the world woke up to the broadcast from Siberia, something happened. Something that went deeper than panic, deeper than fear. People describe it the same way across countries, across languages. They call it the crack, the feeling that reality itself had split open and something ancient was leaking through. It wasn't just the facts that shook them, it was the sound. That broadcast carried something beneath the voices, a hum, a vibration, a tone just low enough that you felt it in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. Some people fainted the moment they heard it. Others sat in silence, unable to move, as if they were hearing something they had always known was there, buried in the edges of their memory. Everywhere, phones rang. Radio stayed on all night. Parents sat awake in dark living rooms while their children whispered about dreams they hadn't had yet. The fear wasn't just what had been found. It was what that discovery meant. If creatures could sleep for millions of years, untouched by extinction, what else had we mistaken for gone? What else was simply waiting for the right sound to wake it up? The crack in reality split wide enough for something else to crawl through. Rumors. Within hours, social media exploded with theories, each more desperate than the last. Some swore the broadcast carried a frequency that infected the brain, a sound so ancient human biology couldn't defend against it. Others insisted the creatures themselves were carriers, their blood laced with prehistoric pathogens that had been sealed under ice until now. Emergency hotlines filled with reports, not of symptoms but of certainty. People were convinced they were already infected, even though no one could explain how. A child in Manchester refused to sleep, claiming they could feel their bones getting older. A woman in Kyoto stood in the middle of traffic, insisting she could hear, her blood humming along with the broadcast. In Buenos Aires, priests declared the discovery was the first trumpet of a biological apocalypse, the earth cleansing itself with a plague older than sin. Medical experts tried to calm the noise, reminding people that sound itself can't carry a disease. But off the record, even they admitted something felt wrong. A pressure in the air, like the atmosphere itself, was too close to the skin. The fear wasn't rational, but that didn't matter. It spread faster than any virus ever could, because it wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear of something deeply known, something ancient inside every living thing. The part of the brain that remembers the world before humans walked it. The part that remembers what hunted us. The scientists who made the discovery should have been celebrated. Nobel Prize committees should have been calling. Instead, they looked like survivors of a shipwreck, dragged into press conferences still soaking wet with fear. They gave interviews, some televised, some over the phone, but every answer felt hollow. They spoke the language of science, but their eyes gave something away. They weren't just explaining. They were confessing. One paleontologist, when asked how it felt to hold the first living creature to emerge from permafrost, broke down on air. He said it was like holding a loaded gun, pointed straight at the species who found it. Off the record, another scientist admitted they were afraid to sleep. Not because of the nightmares, though those had started immediately, but because the hum followed them into their dreams. One biologist confessed that the hatchlings didn't just respond to sound, they seemed to recognize it, as if human speech was somehow familiar to them, like they had heard it before. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. What if they had? What if the sound of human language itself, the rise and fall of speech, the pitch of fear, the crack in the voice of discovery was the very thing the nest had been waiting for. None of the scientists could explain it, but none of them could deny it either. Whatever had been found under the ice wasn't just ancient biology, it was ancient memory, and somehow it remembered us. In the hours that followed, something strange happened. The world shrank. Families who hadn't touched a radio in years dug them out from garages and attics, blowing dust off knobs and dials, desperately scanning frequencies for anything real. Not polished news anchors or scripted government briefings, but voices they could trust. And so radio became a lifeline. The hum of static between broadcasts became the background noise of the world. Families gathered around their kitchen tables, the glow of the dial the only light in the room. In some places, neighbors crammed into basements or shelters, huddled shoulder to shoulder, each person straining to catch every breath, every whisper, every unconfirmed report. Broadcasters were no longer journalists. They were confessors, filling the silence between fear and fact, knowing full well there were no answers to give. Each update felt like a prayer whispered into a void, hoping someone out there was still listening. Call-in lines stayed open for hours. Some callers sobbed without speaking. Others simply asked if anyone at all, knew what was happening at the dig site. The official channels were silent, but pirate stations, broadcasting from garages, attics, even parked cars, filled the void. They shared intercepted transmissions, half-decoded documents, even the distorted fragments of the original Siberian broadcast itself. And in every voice, you could hear the same unspoken plea. If we can keep the signal alive, maybe we can keep reality from breaking completely. But the longer the broadcast went on, the harder it became to separate truth from fear, because in the quiet between updates, some listeners swore they could hear it again, the hum beneath the words. It wasn't coming from the station, it wasn't interference. It was coming from inside the radios themselves. The callers who recognized it first were survivors, not of this disaster, but of others. Chernobyl, 9/11, Fukushima, Katrina, they all described the same internal sound. A crack, not in the air or the earth, but inside the mind itself. The sound of reality fracturing, the moment when what you know and what you believe can no longer hold the same weight. A retired engineer who lived through the Chernobyl meltdown said it was the exact sound he heard over the plant's emergency radio just before they lost all control of the core. A September 11th first responder swore she heard it in the static of her handheld radio right before the South Tower fell. A fisherman from a village wiped off the map by the 2004 tsunami said he heard it, a low hum, like the ocean itself had started breathing in the seconds before the wave hit. And now they were hearing it again. Not during a storm, not after an explosion, but in a broadcast from halfway across the world, a signal riding the edge of human understanding. They didn't know what the hum was. None of them could explain it, but they knew what it meant. Once you hear it, there's no going back. The last call of the night came from a woman, somewhere in the Midwest. Her voice trembled, not from panic, but from certainty. She said her son had been standing at the window, staring into their backyard for almost an hour. She thought he was sleepwalking at first, until she asked him what he was looking at. He said the dinosaur was back. She tried to laugh it off. A bad dream, maybe too much TV, but then she saw it too. A shape, just beyond the porch light, flickering at the edges of reality, like a memory forced into the wrong time. It was gone in seconds, but she knew what she saw. And before the call cut off, she whispered one last thing. It's not just in Siberia anymore. By morning, the site was gone, not physically, but erased from public view. The first reports came from satellite trackers, independent hobbyists who monitor military movements. They noticed Russian troop deployments spiking near the coordinates of the dig site. Convoys of trucks, personnel carriers, even portable jamming towers rolled across the tundra, forming a perimeter around the excavation zone. All communication from inside stopped. No more field reports, no more trembled voices over emergency channels. The researchers who had been so desperate to speak were now completely silent, or silenced. A no-fly zone went up without explanation. Any aircraft approaching within 50 kilometers was immediately redirected or warned to turn back. No civilian drones, no journalists, not even nearby weather flights were allowed to pass overhead. The message was clear: no more witnesses. International media tried to push back, but every request for comment was denied. All questions about the nest, the hatchlings, or the broadcast were met with the same line: routine geological disturbance, no further information. But if that was true, why the military lockdown? Why were biological hazard teams seen arriving alongside armored convoys? And why were international scientists barred from entering the region, despite protocols requiring open cooperation for geological research? Even before the answers came, one thing became painfully obvious. This wasn't about science anymore. This was about containment. But containment of what? As the world waited for answers, stories began to conflict, each more tangled than the last. Russian state media declared the broadcast a hoax, claiming the station's feed had been hijacked by pranksters or foreign intelligence looking to stir global panic. Hours later, a separate statement claimed a toxic biological agent had been uncovered beneath the permafrost, a previously unknown prehistoric virus that could theoretically infect modern species. Then, without warning, religious leaders from Orthodox churches to evangelical ministries issued their own message, declaring the site a doorway between eras, a tear in time exposing humanity to the creatures who ruled the earth before Adam named a single beast. Official channels flipped between these versions like cards shuffled in a losing hand. First a hoax, then a plague, then a warning from God. And every time the story changed, the silence from inside the site grew louder. Meanwhile, intercepted military communications leaked online. Chatter from soldiers posted around the perimeter. They spoke not of fossils or viruses, but of sounds beneath the ice. Not seismic tremors, not machinery malfunction. Something alive, they said. Something that knew it was surrounded. And the question no one dared ask out loud: was the military locking the world out or locking something else in? The silence from official channels didn't last long, because silence leaves a vacuum, and vacuums always fill with secrets. It started as a trickle. An old military contractor, long retired, mentioning in an anonymous forum that this wasn't the first time Soviet teams had dug into that stretch of ice. Within hours, the trickle became a flood as classified Cold War-era documents surfaced. Files that had been buried so deep they were never meant to see daylight. The documents told a story far older than the current expedition. In 1962, a Soviet geological team, part of a project known only as Operation Nestling, detected unusual seismic signatures in the permafrost. They drilled into a subsurface cavity, expecting to find nothing more than trapped methane or ancient ice pockets. But what they found was organic. The files were deliberately vague, parts redacted so heavily the pages looked like black smudges, but a few words repeated over and over: anomaly, heartbeat, and intentional formation. Not random fossils, not ancient sediment. Something that should not have been there, and yet could not have formed by accident. The final pages included orders from high command, instructing the research team to seal the site immediately, backfill the shaft, and erase the coordinates from official geological maps. The scientists who had worked directly at the dig were quietly reassigned, and several simply disappeared. What scared them so much back then, and why was it only surfacing now, after the nest had been disturbed again? One memo hinted at the answer. It wasn't what they found, it was what they heard. A frequency, barely perceptible, riding on the air beneath the ice. A hum, pulsing like a heartbeat held in suspended animation. The same hum that leaked through the recent broadcast. They knew. All along, they knew. And they chose to bury it, not to protect the world from what lay beneath, but to protect whatever lay beneath from the world. The revelations hit global intelligence networks like a hammer blow, and within hours, world leaders were summoned into an emergency diplomatic summit, held behind locked doors with no official record of the conversations inside. But leaks always find cracks, and the whispers that escaped told a story of pure paralysis. On one side sat the governments demanding total suppression, a blackout so complete the world would be told the dig site was lost to a chemical explosion or a localized natural disaster. Their reasoning was brutally simple. Civilization isn't ready for what this means. Faith would collapse, science would fracture, and order would disintegrate into global panic. But the other side, the ones who had seen the leaked memos, the ones who understood this wasn't an isolated event, they argued for something else. They argued that the truth was already awake. The broadcast was out there, fragments circulating on pirate stations and underground networks. Scientists, conspiracy theorists, even ordinary listeners had heard the hum. And once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. One ambassador reportedly warned that suppressing the truth would be like sealing a crack in a dam with tape, a temporary fix that guarantees a catastrophic collapse. The real debate wasn't just about information. It was about responsibility. If something ancient had survived beneath the ice, not just as a fossil, but as a signal, a living echo waiting for the right conditions to call it back, then humanity had already crossed the point of no return. The world had already answered the call simply by listening. The summit ended without resolution. No official statement, no joint press conference, just the unsettling sense that the people in charge were no longer steering the wheel. Some had chosen silence, others had chosen disclosure. But the truth itself, it had chosen to speak. The silence around the dig site didn't last long, not in the age of information, and certainly not when there were still people inside. Late that night, long after official broadcasts had fallen into carefully crafted silence, a rogue signal broke through. At first, it sounded like an old number station, random bursts of static, followed by strings of coordinates. But then came the breathing. Shallow, uneven, human, but wrong. The breath was layered, like more than one person was breathing through the same lungs. It was the sound of someone afraid to speak, afraid to make a single noise louder than the hum beneath their breath. Then came the voices, fragmented, out of order, like a tape recorder left running during a breakdown. They spoke in Russian, English, and something else, a language too ancient for any translation. Scientists pleading for evacuation, technicians sobbing that the ground was breathing, a single voice repeating the phrase, "We opened it, we can't close it." The broadcast crackled in and out, but something deeper rode the signal. A sound beneath the voices, wet movement against ice, the scrape of something enormous shifting through tunnels that shouldn't exist. The movement wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, like a thing exploring the edges of its prison. Then, for just a moment, the signal cleared. A man's voice, older, strained, nearly breaking, spoke directly into the microphone. No distortion, no static. He said the site was never meant to be uncovered. Not because of what was inside, but because of what would come looking for it once it woke up. The broadcast held for exactly 3 minutes and 24 seconds. Then the line severed. But just before the signal died completely, something else came through. A whisper, clear enough to cut straight to the bone. "We dug too deep," that was all it said. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words, spoken in a voice that sounded like it had traveled centuries just to say them. Then, silence. Not the silence of an empty frequency, but something sharper. A silence with weight. Like the air itself had been cut apart and left to bleed. The pirate station vanished after that. The feed was scrubbed from archives, search engines mysteriously failed, and any attempt to replay the signal returned nothing but a blank void. But those words, they stayed. They spread, passed from listener to listener, a warning whispered into the cracks of a world already coming apart. We dug too deep. The official silence left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Within hours, that space was filled, not by scientists or governments, but by preachers, prophets, and self-proclaimed messengers of God, flooding the airwaves with something far older than evidence: belief. Some called it a sign from heaven, proof that the great cycles were starting over, that the world was returning to the chaos before creation, when beasts ruled the earth and humanity was nothing but a whisper in the dirt. Others claimed it was a test, a warning sent not to humanity as a whole, but to those who could still hear. Religious leaders from Orthodox monasteries to evangelical pulpits declared that the discovery in Siberia wasn't scientific at all. It was a divine reset, the earth itself rejecting its latest occupants, cracking open the frozen vault to release what came before us. The language shifted quickly, from research and evidence to prophecy and punishment. In sermons broadcast across continents, priests and pastors invoked stories from Genesis, Revelation, even older texts buried deep in forgotten books of Apocrypha. They spoke of cycles before history, species erased not by meteors or ice, but by the hand of God itself, wiping the slate clean so something older could return. And then came the warning that sent shivers down every frequency. If the nest had opened, it meant the covenant was broken, the one that kept the ancient things sleeping. The discovery wasn't an accident. It was a summons. It didn't take long for belief to mutate. Across forums, encrypted channels, and dark corners of the web, something new began to take shape. A cult with no single name, spreading faster than fact. They didn't just fear the nest, they worshipped it. They called it the first nest, the place where creation itself began. Not in a garden, but in the frozen dark, where life was seeded long before the first sunrise. They believed the creatures stirring beneath the ice weren't just ancient, they were divine. Beasts forged before the separation between flesh and spirit, when life was one thing, not divided into mortal and eternal. They began to gather at frozen lakes, at caves long sealed by ice, chanting phrases lifted directly from the corrupted broadcast. Some claimed to dream of the hatchlings, not as monsters, but as heralds, beings who carried the true shape of creation, the shape the earth remembers, even if we've forgotten. Members of the cult began carving spirals into their skin, spirals matching the formation of the eggs, matching the shape of the fossil chamber itself, as if that symbol existed before language, encoded in both stone and flesh. They believed the nest wasn't just a birthplace. It was a blueprint, a design for what comes next. And if the first nest has opened, they said, it means the world is already returning to its original shape. As the cults spread, so did the sightings. At first, they came as isolated reports: a farmer in Alberta, a night shift worker in northern Sweden, a child walking home in rural Alaska. All of them described the same thing: something moving at the edges of the dark, a shape too big to be a man, too ancient to be a bear, too wrong to be anything alive today. The creatures didn't attack. They didn't make a sound. They watched, flickering in and out like a memory trying to manifest in the present, struggling to fully enter this time, this air, this reality. The broadcast crackled in and out, but something deeper rode the signal, a sound beneath the voices, wet movement against ice, the scrape of something enormous shifting through tunnels that shouldn't exist. The movement wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, like a thing exploring the edges of its prison. Then, for just a moment, the signal cleared. A man's voice, older, strained, nearly breaking, spoke directly into the microphone. No distortion, no static. He said the site was never meant to be uncovered, not because of what was inside, but because of what would come looking for it once it woke up. The broadcast held for exactly 3 minutes and 24 seconds. Then the line severed, but just before the signal died completely, something else came through. A whisper, clear enough to cut straight to the bone. "We dug too deep." That was all it said. No explanation, no context. Just those 4 words, spoken in a voice that sounded like it had traveled centuries just to say them. Then silence. Not the silence of an empty frequency, but something sharper. A silence with weight. Like the air itself had been cut apart and left to bleed. The pirate station vanished after that. The feed was scrubbed from archives, search engines mysteriously failed, and any attempt to replay the signal returned nothing but a blank void. But those words, they stayed. They spread, passed from listener to listener, a warning whispered into the cracks of a world already coming apart. We dug too deep. The official silence left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Within hours, that space was filled, not by scientists or governments, but by preachers, prophets, and self-proclaimed messengers of God, flooding the airwaves with something far older than evidence, belief. Some called it a sign from heaven, proof that the great cycles were starting over, that the world was returning to the chaos before creation, when beasts ruled the earth and humanity was nothing but a whisper in the dirt. Others claimed it was a test, a warning sent not to humanity as a whole, but to those who could still hear. Religious leaders from Orthodox monasteries to evangelical pulpits declared that the discovery in Siberia wasn't scientific at all. It was a divine reset, the earth itself rejecting its latest occupants, cracking open the frozen vault to release what came before us. The language shifted quickly, from research and evidence to prophecy and punishment. In sermons broadcast across continents, priests and pastors invoked stories from Genesis, Revelation, even older texts, buried deep in forgotten books of Apocrypha. They spoke of cycles before history, species erased not by meteors or ice, but by the hand of God itself, wiping the slate clean so something older could return. And then came the warning that sent shivers down every frequency. If the nest had opened, it meant the covenant was broken, the one that kept the ancient things sleeping. The discovery wasn't an accident, it was a summons. It didn't take long for belief to mutate. Across forums, encrypted channels, and dark corners of the web, something new began to take shape. A cult with no single name, spreading faster than fact. They didn't just fear the nest, they worshipped it. They called it the first nest, the place where creation itself began. Not in a garden, but in the frozen dark, where life was seated long before the first sunrise. They believed the creatures stirring beneath the ice weren't just ancient, they were divine, beasts forged before the separation between flesh and spirit, when life was one thing, not divided into mortal and eternal. They began to gather at frozen lakes, at caves long sealed by ice, chanting phrases lifted directly from the corrupted broadcast. Some claimed to dream of the hatchlings, not as monsters, but as heralds, beings who carried the true shape of creation, the shape the earth remembers, even if we've forgotten. Members of the cult began carving spirals into their skin, spirals matching the formation of the eggs, matching the shape of the fossil chamber itself, as if that symbol existed before language. Encoded in both stone and flesh, they believed the nest wasn't just a birthplace, it was a blueprint, a design for what comes next. And if the first nest has opened, they said, it means the world is already returning to its original shape. As the cult spread, so did the sightings. At first, they came as isolated reports. A farmer in Alberta, a night shift worker in northern Sweden, a child walking home in rural Alaska. All of them described the same thing, something moving at the edges of the dark, a shape too big to be a man, too ancient to be a bear, too wrong to be anything alive today. The creatures didn't attack. They didn't make a sound. They watched, flickering in and out like a memory trying to manifest in the present, struggling to fully enter this time, this air, this reality. In some cases, their footprints were found, too large for any living predator. Claws too long for anything that belongs to this age. In others, nothing remained but the feeling, a presence so cold it left frost on glass inside the house. Callers to emergency lines described flickering shadows, their outlines matching no known species, yet eerily close to the ancient sketches drawn from fossil evidence. Long tails, spined backs, claws that clicked against pavement like dripping water in a cave. The sightings were dismissed at first, hallucinations fed by global hysteria. But then, security cameras captured one. The footage, released through an anonymous account, showed a shape not fully there. A beast half-formed from air and ice and memory, standing perfectly still at the edge of a suburban street. And in the silence before it disappeared, the audio caught something else, a low, rhythmic hum, pulsing in time with the beat of the earth itself. There's a point where science stops being useful. It happened faster than anyone expected. The biologists and geologists and virologists, the experts who stood in front of cameras, who once spoke with certainty, they began using words like unprecedented and unexplainable, until finally they stopped speaking at all. Because what do you say when the laws you spent your life believing in, biology, geology, time itself, start to fold like paper? That's when the ancient explanations crawled back in, not superstition, not fantasy, but something older than language, the kind of ancestral knowledge passed through bloodlines and whispered over campfires. What if the earth remembers? What if extinction isn't the end, but a pause, a holding breath, and all it takes to restart the old world is the wrong sound, the wrong touch, or the wrong species digging in the wrong place? What if memory itself has weight, and the ground beneath our feet isn't just rock and dirt, but a recording? Every death, every extinction, every forgotten thing pressed into the earth like a fossil of memory, just waiting for the right trigger to call it back? Science couldn't answer that, because science had already fallen silent. The last voice came from a preacher broadcasting from a chapel, so remote no one even knew its call sign. His voice shook, not from age, but from awe, and something close to surrender. He said the discovery was not an event. It was a return. Not the apocalypse. Not judgment. Something older. He called them the old ones, the first children of the earth, whose shapes were buried in stone and soul alike. And before the transmission cut, he gave one last warning, his voice trembling through static. The old ones walk again. The Siberian nest wasn't discovered by accident, and it wasn't discovered for the first time. Declassified files, pried loose by independent researchers digging through Cold War archives, confirmed what the world had started to suspect. The Soviets knew. Long before the modern expedition broke the ice, there were other digs, secret expeditions carried out under the cover of geological surveys in the early 1960s. Officially, those teams were studying permafrost dynamics. Unofficially, they were hunting something else, organic signatures that shouldn't have existed in layers that deep. One file referenced soft tissue recovered from ice deposits dated to the late Cretaceous, but no samples were ever logged in Soviet scientific journals. Because the discovery wasn't reported to the scientific community, it went directly to the military. The files show that after the discovery of the first nest, as they called it, the dig site was sealed and classified under the codename Operation Nestling. Reports from the lead paleontologist vanished. His family filed a missing persons report 2 years later. It was quietly closed without explanation. The site itself was erased from geological surveys, as if the ground itself had swallowed the evidence. What scared them so badly? The files never say directly, but in the margins, handwritten in a trembling hand, were 5 words. The bones were still warm. The Soviets weren't the first to dig there. Long before tanks rolled over the permafrost, the indigenous tribes who lived along the outer edge of the site knew what slept below. Their oral histories spoke of a forbidden seam, a boundary between worlds beneath the ice, where the earth still remembered its first children. The warnings weren't metaphor, they were geographic instructions: stay away from the warm veins in the ice. Elders told stories of hunters who crossed those lines and came back changed, speaking languages no one understood and coughing up earth instead of blood. When Soviet scientists arrived, they dismissed the warnings as superstitious nonsense, calling the legends fossil folklore, myths invented to explain strange geological features. The locals begged them to stop digging. The ground, they said, could hear the drills, but the scientists dug anyway. They broke through the boundary, and the earth has been leaking ever since. The more the files revealed, the more the story twisted. The nest, what the world saw as a scientific marvel, was never just a natural formation. According to Soviet biological warfare documents, the excavation site had once been classified as a biological weapons testing ground. Not for modern pathogens, but for something far older. The files suggested the Soviets believed the preserved organic matter wasn't just a remnant of prehistoric life. It was a biological template, a genetic blueprint that could be reactivated. They believed the ancient organisms contained adaptive traits, immune responses, environmental tolerances that could be extracted, weaponized, and even reintroduced into the modern biosphere. They weren't trying to understand evolution. They were trying to hijack it. Some files even hinted that certain species were deliberately awakened, not by accident, but as controlled resurrections. They weren't studying dinosaurs. They were rebuilding them cell by cell, manipulating ancient immune systems to create pathogens that could rewrite ecosystems. The most chilling line appeared in a 1963 progress report, signed by a now vanished microbiologist. They were designed to outlive extinction itself. If that was true, the nest wasn't a burial ground at all. It was a lab left running for 66 million years. And the species meant to inherit it? We just broke the seal. The next voice didn't come from a scientist, a soldier, or a preacher. It came from a man no one expected, a former Soviet intelligence officer, speaking from hiding, his voice aged and splintered by decades of secrets. He didn't bother with introductions. No name, no rank, just a confession, delivered like a man unburdening his soul before the end. The excavation site, he said, was never random. The coordinates weren't chosen because of geological surveys or accidental seismic readings. That ground was marked decades before the first drill broke the ice, because something else had marked it first. The officer claimed that the nest itself was a trap, not for the creatures inside, but for whoever was foolish enough to open it. A containment system, built not by humans, but by something older, something that understood survival not as biology, but as architecture. Layers of earth and ice forming a lock so perfect it had held for millions of years, and the Soviets knew. They found evidence, not fossils, but structures. Symmetrical, deliberate, as if the nest had been placed, not left behind. And deep within the first shaft they opened, they found something worse than bones. They found a mirror, not of glass but of flesh, reflecting not the faces of the scientists, but something that had been waiting for their return. The officer's final warning was simple. We were never the first ones to find it, and we were never supposed to survive the second time. Hours after the rogue broadcast, a single image appeared online, briefly, before vanishing from official servers. It came from a classified satellite feed, one programmed to monitor geological shifts in Siberia's permafrost. But the image it captured wasn't seismic activity. It was a shape, enormous, distorted by layers of ice, but moving. The figure was too large to be human, too defined to be a glitch, and too familiar to dismiss. It was curled inside the earth like a creature waiting to be born. Its eyes, if they were eyes, open, And the caption attached to the leak said only this: "Still waking up." When the first reports broke, governments scrambled to control the story. But stories like this don't get controlled. They spread like cracks in glass, too fast and too wide to stop. Some nations dismissed the entire event as fabrication, an elaborate hoax designed to distract the public from economic collapse or military maneuvers. Others went the opposite direction, declaring emergency lockdowns, shutting borders, and grounding flights with no explanation. The contradictions came faster than facts. One broadcast promised total containment, while the next warned citizens to prepare for airborne pathogens. Press conferences dissolved into panicked arguments between officials who clearly hadn't received the same briefings. Military units mobilized, not just in Siberia, but across northern territories. In Alaska, in Finland, even in northern Canada, soldiers erected containment checkpoints on roads leading nowhere. No one could explain what they were trying to contain, only that something was moving. In the absence of truth, panic became the only language left. Rumors spread faster than radio signals. Some said the creatures were already moving south. Others claimed the discovery had triggered tectonic instability, with ancient biological systems reawakening under the crust itself. By the time world leaders addressed the public, their words were already obsolete. The story had taken on a life of its own, beyond policy, beyond science. The world wasn't asking for answers anymore. The world was waiting for the next sound. One by one, the experts disappeared. The biologists who had analyzed the hatchlings, the geologists who first identified the impossible organic seams beneath the ice, even the linguists brought in to decipher ancient symbols found carved into frozen rock. Gone. Phones disconnected. Offices stripped. Social media accounts wiped clean. Official statements called it routine relocation. Scientists reassigned to secure facilities for their safety. But their families told a different story. They described men in unmarked vehicles, arriving without warning, escorting scientists out of their homes without time to pack. Some left half-eaten meals on the table. One left her phone recording, capturing a low hum before the line went dead. Where did they go? No one could say, but among the conspiracy networks, one theory took hold. The scientists weren't silenced. They were recruited, taken into clandestine research collectives where governments no longer set the rules, and understanding the nest was worth more than any nation's survival. In a final act of desperation, rival nations set aside treaties and hostilities. They launched joint expeditions, multinational teams of soldiers, scientists, and intelligence operatives, all racing toward the nest, each hoping to claim control before the others. Some called it a scientific rescue mission. Others called it a treasure hunt for the first biological superweapon. None of the teams made it past the first day. Each expedition reported strange failures, navigation systems twisting coordinates into circles, biological sensors detecting heartbeats where no living things should exist. Radio transmissions grew increasingly fragmented, voices stretched into unnatural tones, as if the ice itself was interfering. Then, one by one, the teams went silent. The only thing left behind was a scrambled, looping broadcast from one expedition leader, 5 words repeated over and over, voice cracking into static. We were not the first. The nest didn't stay isolated for long. Reports started coming in from towns hundreds of miles away. Small disturbances at first. Animals acting strangely, refusing to enter certain patches of forest. Birds abandoning their migration patterns entirely. Then came the illnesses. Not a virus, not bacteria, something deeper. People reported a pressure in their bones, as if the air itself was too heavy to breathe. Some claimed their dreams shifted, filling with images they had no language for. Prehistoric landscapes, glimpses of creatures half born from rock and fog. Satellite thermal scans revealed heat blooms radiating outward from the dig site, spreading beneath the ground, altering the soil itself. In some areas, vegetation withered into ancient ferns, species that shouldn't exist anymore. Whatever had been contained in the nest wasn't just waking up. It was rewriting the land, resetting the biological clock. The contamination wasn't a leak. It was a pulse, a signal that the world had started remembering what it used to be. Near the Arctic Circle, hunters and villagers began reporting something impossible. At night, shapes moved along the tree lines, too large, too wrong, flickering like images caught between frequencies. Predators with spines too long, jaws too wide, and movements that belonged to a world that should have stayed dead. Some said they were ghosts of extinct species, flickering out of ancient memory. Others insisted they were real, flesh returning to claim territory. But the stories all ended the same way. The predators weren't afraid of the light. Then came the final message, broadcast on every frequency, in every language, from stations no one could trace. The voice was emotionless, almost mechanical, but clear. All nations, all citizens, prepare for biological unknowns. This is not a test. Then, silence. It started just after midnight. A frequency no one was meant to hear again. Emergency bands lit up without warning, a fractured burst of sound crackling through the static like a voice drowning in ice. It was the Siberian research team, or what was left of them. Their voices came through in pieces, some too low to hear, others so sharp they cut into the speakers, each word split in half, as if they were trying to speak through a mouth that no longer belonged to them. At first, they repeated coordinates over and over, even though everyone already knew where the site was. But then, the words shifted, bleeding into something older than language. Half scientific terminology, half prayer, spoken in rhythms that didn't match any human language ever recorded. One voice, the lead biologist, or what used to be her, began describing what they saw beneath the nest, her tone swinging wildly between clinical detachment and animal fear. She said the ice didn't just preserve organic matter, it preserved a message encoded not in words, but in form. The shape of the nest, the spiral of the eggs, even the fractures in the surrounding rock, they were instructions, a design burned into the earth itself. As her voice trembled, the others joined in. Not like a conversation, but like a choir, speaking in unison, despite being in separate locations. Their voices harmonized into a single frequency, resonating not just through radios, but through every device capable of transmitting sound. For exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds, the team spoke as one entity, not entirely human anymore. Their language bent into something that felt too old for vocal cords, too deliberate for panic. Then came the silence. But silence didn't mean the broadcast ended. It meant something else was ready to speak. When the voices returned, they were changed. Too calm, too certain, like people who had seen the answer to every question and couldn't decide whether to be horrified or relieved. They explained what none of the reports, none of the files, none of the scientists ever understood. The nest was not a tomb. It was a door. Every assumption about the discovery was wrong. This wasn't the accidental survival of prehistoric life. This was intentional preservation. Not by nature, not by chance, but by something that came before both. The nest wasn't buried by time. It was locked, sealed beneath the ice with deliberate precision, each layer meant to delay the inevitable. The spiral of eggs, it wasn't a natural formation, it was a pattern, a biological key designed to react only when a certain species, our species, made enough noise, emitted the right frequencies, dug too deep, spoke the wrong words. The researchers realized too late. We were the trigger. The nest had been waiting, not for its parents, not for predators, but for witnesses. It needed someone to find it, someone to see it, because seeing was part of the ritual. Recognition itself completed the circuit. And once the circuit was complete, the door opened. The creatures inside weren't dinosaurs. Not exactly. They were something older, from a time when the boundary between biology and geology didn't exist. Life and Earth were the same thing, pulsing together like a planetary heartbeat. The nest was never a birthplace. It was a relay station, a place where Earth itself could remember what it once was and decide what it wanted to become next. And now, with the door open, the choice wasn't ours anymore. When the broadcast resumed, the team's voices were different, flattened, stripped of panic, almost too calm, like they'd passed through the kind of terror that rewires the human brain into something colder. They didn't talk about dinosaurs. They didn't talk about fossils. They didn't even talk about survival. They talked about something thinking beneath the ice. They said it was older than biology itself. Not a species, not a creature in any sense we understand. It was the memory of life, imprinted in the very rock, waiting for the right frequency to bring it to the surface again. It wasn't intelligence as we know it, nothing conscious, nothing emotional, but something deeper, a process that had outlived every extinction event, adapting to each new form of life that crawled across the planet. It had no face, no language, no desire, just the need to evolve, to reshape the world in its image again and again. With each cycle of death and rebirth, the team described it like a mirror buried in stone, reflecting back the form of whatever disturbed it. In the Cambrian era, it took the shape of armored sea life. In the age of reptiles, it became scaled and cold-blooded. And now it was studying us. Every word we spoke into the microphones, every heartbeat the team broadcast through the static, it was listening, matching our rhythms, learning how to become us. The biologist said something strange before her voice dissolved into static. She said evolution wasn't random. It wasn't survival of the fittest. It was survival of the remembered, a loop where ancient life remembered its predators, its disasters, its mistakes, and adapted for the next cycle. Now, for the first time in planetary history, we are the remembered. As the team spoke, the broadcast itself shifted. The usual background static, solar noise, magnetic interference, the hum of failing equipment was replaced. A sound emerged underneath the voices, not speech, not the howl of wind or the grinding of ice, something deeper, lower, vibrating below the range of normal hearing, except it wasn't heard through the ears. It was felt directly inside the skull. Every listener described it differently. Some said it felt like a heartbeat pressed against bone. Others said it was like the sound of your own blood rushing, but heard from outside your body. The longer the broadcast continued, the louder it grew, not in volume, but in presence, until it felt like the sound wasn't just in the radios anymore. It was in the walls. It was in the air. The researchers' words started to break apart. Syllables stretched and twisted to match the hum. It wasn't just a broadcast anymore. It was a resonance, a frequency the human voice couldn't help but follow. Then came the chorus. Not from the team, not from the equipment, from the ice itself. A layered, inhuman choir, speaking in every language and no language, vibrating inside the bones of the world. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a threat. It was recognition. The Earth's memory had woken up, and it knew exactly who was listening. The voices of the research team fractured one last time, splitting apart into static and breath and something that sounded like bone creaking under pressure. But beneath the distortion, beneath the hum, they spoke directly to us, to the listeners, to everyone who had stayed tuned in since the first garbled report broke through the static from Siberia. They said something no one was prepared to hear. The broadcast wasn't just a transmission. It was a beacon. Every ear that heard the signal became part of it. Every phone, every speaker, every car radio, it was all part of a global feedback loop, turning human technology into a resonator, amplifying the same frequency that woke the nest in the first place. The act of listening, the simple, innocent human reflex of turning up the volume, leaning closer to the speaker, following the story to its end, had turned every listener into a carrier. We weren't just hearing the signal, we were amplifying it. Every heartbeat in sync with the hum, every nervous breath filling the silence between broadcasts, every pulse of curiosity feeding the intelligence beneath the ice, giving it a map, not just to the research team, not just to the dig site, but to everywhere the broadcast had reached. The discovery wasn't about prehistoric life. It wasn't about ancient predators or genetic resurrection. It was about memory. The Earth's memory waking up, stretching through human voices, using our own curiosity to complete the loop. We didn't just listen to the past, we invited it inside. The team's final words were clear, even through the rising distortion. You're still listening, but so are they. Then came the static. Not random noise, but rhythmic, deliberate. The hum had learned our language, and it was speaking us back into the world. The transmission ended, not with a final word, not with a warning, but with a silence too perfect to be accidental. No confirmation of the team's fate, no official statement, no emergency broadcast to follow, just a silence that stretched across every frequency that had carried the story. For hours after, radio hosts, podcasters, even emergency dispatchers reported the same eerie phenomenon. An echo riding beneath their voices, a sound too low to register consciously, but too persistent to ignore. Listeners called in to describe the silence itself feeling alive, like something was pressing against the air, waiting for the next word to complete the cycle. The story had vanished, but it left a space, an empty frequency where something ancient now lived, waiting for the next time someone would tune in and say, "Are you still listening?" Because the real question wasn't whether the story had ended. The real question was whether we'd just heard the beginning of our own extinction. You've been listening, and so have they. But before we end this transmission, there's something I need to ask you. Something that might be the most important question you'll ever answer. Do you remember the first sound you ever heard? Not your mother's voice, not a song, not even your own cry, but the very first sound your bones recognized before you had a name for it. Because if the earth remembers, if water remembers, if stone remembers, what makes you think memory stops with us? Maybe we're not the first species to send a signal into the dark. Maybe the hum we've all been hearing didn't come from the ice at all. Maybe it came from us. Some ancient part of humanity, long buried, waiting to be remembered. If you felt something tonight, a pressure behind your eyes, a breath that wasn't yours, a shape in the silence, I need you to tell us, right now, what did you hear? And more importantly, do you think something heard you back? Leave your answer in the comments, and if you've stayed with us this long, subscribe. This won't be the last time we follow a signal into the dark. Share this broadcast with someone you trust, someone you want to remember you, in case the earth forgets us next. For now, the frequency goes silent. But silence is never empty. It's just the sound of something listening back.